And so what a place like Massachusetts, and really the whole billion rich people, should be doing is to create the tools by which those 6 billion people can grow and enjoy energy and grow up out of poverty into prosperity without burning fossil fuels. It means we need to be creating new technologies that can work in those parts of the world, because it's really expensive to do it the way we're trying to do it in Massachusetts or Germany. So this is my nuclear power pitch to the
Okay.
nuclear industry: is make it cheap. It's got to be, we've got to figure a way to do this cheaper. And part of that is getting over the radiation fear that leads to this overregulation. That means that every power plant needs to be, spending tons of money to prevent tiny amounts of radiation from being released. And part of it is just that the industry needs to focus more on cheap solutions that will work around the world.
Just because the facts are A, if the narrative is B and everyone believes the narrative, then B is what matters. But it's our job in our industry to speak up proudly, soberly, and to engage people in this dialogue. Those 2.5 billion people that are in energy poverty, they need us.
America cannot meet this threat alone.
If there is a single country,
of course, the world cannot meet it without America.
that is willing to
But we're going to need you, the next generation, to finish the
overhaul
job.
nuclear regulation,
We need scientists to design new
and
fuels.
focus on net public
We need
benefit
engineers to invent new technologies. We
over absurd levels of radiation
need
protection,
entrepreneurs to sell those
then
technologies.
we will march towards this.
We need workers to operate assembly lines that hum with high-tech,
we
zero-carbon
have
components.
unlimited prosperity for all humans.
We need diplomats and businessmen and women and Peace Corps volunteers to help developing nations skip past the dirty phase of development and transition to sustainable sources of energy. In other words, we need you.
Welcome to another episode of the Fire to Fission podcast, where we talk about energy-dense fuels and how they can better human lives. My name's Mark Hinaman, and I'm joined today by Dr. Joshua Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is the Professor Emeritus of International Relations, American University, and Research Scholar Department of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts. Dr. Goldstein, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on. How are you?
Yeah, excellent. Well, we normally kick this off by having folks give kind of a 30 to 60 second elevator pitch. So to help our audience familiarize themselves with who you are, and then we've got a lot to talk about. So
Sure. I'm an old environmentalist. I'm still an environmentalist. And I used to be against nuclear power for the obvious reasons. And then I became a global trends kind of person in international relations, got interested in climate change because I had children, and discovered that we need a lot of nuclear power to solve climate change. No way about it. Two ways about it. And so I learned about it and discovered actually I do like it. And so I wrote a book about it, how Sweden decarbonized quickly. And then Oliver Stone just turned the book into a film, and here we are.
yeah, excellent. I've got a lot to dive into. Some about your previous books and your previous works, and the movie, right? Nuclear Now. Lots to discuss. So let's start with this idea of, well, first off, you've done a ton of work. I did some homework on you before we did this interview, and your library of work is extensive. I was impressed. But you do have on your webpage one. It's kind of like a Wikipedia. What's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like a Wikipedia delimiter or ambiguity. That's like, who is the Joshua Goldstein?
Oh, right. Yeah, when I was a kid, Joshua was a very unusual name. People would say, oh, that's a pretty name. I've never heard that before, kind of thing. And then when I was about probably 30 years old, which was a long time ago, it just hit the wave of Joshua's and Jennifer's, right? And so then everybody from a Goldstein family named their kid Joshua, and now there's a lot of us running around. But I'm the joshuagoldstein.com, so I get to put up the disambiguation page on my website.
I love it. Joshua, why don't you talk a little bit about 2 or 3 projects that you worked on in your career that you're proud of, or maybe some that you dread remembering?
Well, one that I'm proud of is my work on war and gender. It's the title of the book. I wrote it about 20 years ago, and it started in graduate school. I was studying international relations, and I thought, so much of what goes on in international relations is shaped by gender expectations. And so much of what happens in war is organized around gender. And I began to realize so much of what happens in gender is organized around war and the need to possibly go to war. You know, you can think you have a peaceful society, but you could be overrun by a neighbor or something. And you could need to mobilize an army. And we raise boys in preparation for that possibility. So this kind of extensive interplay between gender in our day-to-day lives and war and the not prevalence but ubiquity of the possibility of war in our societies. You know, you never know if you're going to need to go to war. So I wrote a book about that. Well, no, first I took notes in graduate school and made a note to myself about the projects that were sort of unfinished that I was carrying forward into my professor years. And one of them, the note said, war and gender, most interesting of all, will ruin career, wait till after tenure. So it's more or less what I did. I wrote a few other books and I got back and wrote it's a big interdisciplinary book with a lot of evidence from this, you know, topic in different disciplines, psychology and political science and the biological stuff and the history and so forth, and sort of compiled it all in a readable form in a big, thick book. And that won the Book of the Decade Award from International Studies Association. So that's an award
That's great.
I like, you know. So,
yeah, that's awesome.
So that was one. And then, hold on, I'm going to silence my phone. Should have done it at the outset. And then, of course, I wrote a book 10 years ago called Winning the War on War. It was also pretty interesting because it was about the trend. I had a textbook in international relations, and every year I would update it. And it had a list of the wars in progress, where they were, how big they were. And I noticed after more than a decade that the number of wars was shrinking. This was post-Cold War era. Fewer wars, smaller wars. So I wrote a whole book about that, why people don't see, you know, as long as there's one war going on, it's one too many, and all the reporters will focus there and everyone will say the world's going to hell, look at this war going on. But in fact, if you get way back and look at it from a distance, there were fewer wars. And just at that time, Professor Steven Pinker at Harvard, who's got a bigger following than me by a long shot, was working on the same topic and wrote his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. So we worked together a little bit while I was doing my book and he doing his. His is more sweeping and more historical. Mine is more the last few decades, what's going on and what's the role of the United Nations in it, which is something I think underappreciated by people. So I was also pleased with that project. And then the latest one, the book's called A Bright Future, How Some Countries Have Decarbonized and the Others Can Follow. I worked with a young Swedish nuclear engineer, Staffan Kvist, and just wrote about how Sweden had very quickly built nuclear power, got rid of fossil fuels, decarbonized their grid decades ago. And as you know, France did the same thing. Ontario's done a similar thing. So these are our proven models. And it was just great to write about, you know, what we can do about climate change, and that this can go very fast and be very affordable. And we know it works because a big country like France did it and successfully. So that's our model. And then, of course, turning it into an Oliver Stone movie is another whole level of
that's always helpful, right?
Impact and also craziness. I spent a few years on that, my first and probably last Hollywood project. I don't know. You never know.
Was it exhausting? I imagine
it was
it
kind
sounds
of exhausting,
tiring,
but it would come in waves where I would write. So the whole dynamic here was that I knew the material and Oliver Stone didn't know anything about it, really, the science of it.
That's really helpful. That's like a great way to do a documentary,
but
right?
He knew how to make a movie, and I didn't know anything about it. I've never worked on a movie before. So I would write stuff that was accurate and compelling and logical, but boring, right? The professor. And then he, the filmmaker, would write stuff that was scintillating and exciting and emotional, but it was all wrong factually. And so we'd go back and forth on this. And then, so I'd wait for weeks. Nothing would happen. I'd be waiting for something to happen. And then he'd suddenly call up and say, "Oh, I've got a new way to do it. I'm sending you a new version." And everything would be changed. It would be all full of mistakes again. And then we work forward from there again. It took 3 years instead of one that it was supposed to. Of course, there's a pandemic in there. And eventually we got to a film that I really like. I think it's really great. And it's gotten very good feedback from the people who've seen it.
I loved it. I thought it was great. I want to talk about the film, but before we do, I love that you focused on war for a lot of your career. I mean, it's always relevant throughout history, but I've got a long flight coming up, so I'll have to pick up the War and Gender book. I'm excited for that.
Oh, yeah. Well, so my focus is not about how to fight wars or how to win wars, which I really don't know anything about. I never was in the military, luckily never was in a war from any position. But it's about the effect of war on society and the effect of society on war. It's kind of that relationship of what role does war play in our collective lives, our collective imaginations, how we organize ourselves as society. So I've written about war in economics, war in gender, of course, and war in diplomacy and kind of stuff, like how that relationship is so important. But often we're just focused on, there isn't any war, it's peace, and then war breaks out, and then it's war, and then how do we fight the war? What do we do?
Now, I'm curious, Dr. Goldstein. You self-admitted. You said back when you were younger, or a long time ago. I mean, when I see you on camera now, I would say you're not a day over maybe 26 or 28, but maybe that's just the resolution's low. I don't know. But I'm curious. You might be a little older or more familiar with kind of Cold War era, and you mentioned starting as an environmentalist, and I'm curious on that nuclear historically had a bad rap, right, from Cold War, and this whole dichotomy of, well, all the data shows that it's great for the environment, but most environmental groups are against it. Feels like a hangover from this war piece, right, from the bomb.
Yeah, it's crazy and it's so frustrating. But I was in that generation that hid under our desks preparing for a nuclear attack, So, have this drill where you put your head under your desk and you kind of have the sense, even at a tender age, that it's not really going to help. And it's just kind of
5 years old, and you're like, "What is this?" My dad said the same thing. He was characterized as, "Well, this is where we kind of just get under the desk and
right.
assume this position." And all of a sudden, you're thinking, you're gonna kiss your ass goodbye, right?
Yeah, right. At 5, you might believe it, but by 10, you certainly know that's not going to work. And it was an existential kind of dread that we all had, because at any moment and with little warning, this siren could start wailing, and you look up on your classroom wall to see what that particular pattern of siren means, and it means the missiles are incoming, and in less than 30 minutes, you're going to be gone. Everybody you know, everything you love is going to be gone. The whole civilization is going to be gone, right, in 30 minutes. And that's just very hard to grow up in that kind of environment. And so we had trauma response to it, I think, collectively.
Yeah.
And when you're traumatized,
I think so.
You don't think clearly. And then, as we talk about in the film, there were elements in society that didn't like nuclear energy, and one of them was the Rockefeller Foundation, starting right at the outset of the Cold War. They told themselves, and I'm sure it had truth to it, that they wanted to make people afraid of radiation because that way they'd stop the atmospheric bomb tests. We had hundreds of these, let's blow off a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere and let the radioactive byproducts all just drift where they go. And I don't think it really was harmful to people but it was good that we stopped doing it. And so if people are afraid of radiation, they'll stop this testing, and that'll stop people developing new bombs, and it'll end the arms race. So all it did was push the testing underground when they had the partial test ban treaty. And it didn't stop the arms race. It didn't stop the Cold War, any of that.
Engineers, military, they're creative, right? Oh, we can't test bombs in the atmosphere.
The fact that the Rockefeller Foundation also was the embodiment of, especially at that time, very closely tied to the Rockefeller family, and all their wealth that they were giving out for mostly very noble causes was from fossil fuels. And this was a competing energy source that I hope will put fossil fuels out of business. So it's hard to untangle quite what their motivations was, but it had a huge effect because people like me who were already afraid of the weapons and war just became afraid of everything radioactive, everything to do with nuclear, anything. And then, as you know, came the movies that we watched, starting from Godzilla, and it came from the deep, and this kind of stuff where it always starts with some radioactive material which somehow causes a mutation that makes monsters grow, and then the monsters are wreaking havoc. Be it an octopus taking out the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, or Godzilla knocking down power
Yeah.
lines, and all that kind of stuff. So, and then Hollywood continued with China Syndrome in 1979, which I remember watching, and it was, it made you scared. That's what it was supposed to do. Hollywood's good at that.
Right.
And of course, 3 Mile Island being greatly overhyped because it came out right in the middle of that film, and the atmosphere around it, and Silkwood in the 1980s, and it's just continued on through. The Simpsons, of course, it's just a joke in The Simpsons, and yet those attitudes stick still. People, what they know about nuclear power, they learned from The Simpsons. It's
So it really was kind of this prevalent story throughout
completely
pop
off
culture.
that nuclear waste is this green goop. I don't even know where that comes from. And that the waste is stored in yellow barrels. There's always these yellow barrels strewn around everywhere. And it's like complete fictions. But that's what we had. So we were all against it. Okay, that's a long answer to your question. I'm not sure if we got to the question yet.
So the accumulation of all of these things, the prevalence in pop culture, the bomb test, the propaganda campaign from certain philanthropic organizations against radiation.
And then
Hollywood,
right?
The Hollywood effort, right?
And then the environmental groups, and that's kind of a long story. I don't know if you want to go into it, but the environmental groups, like the Sierra Club, was originally pro-nuclear power. And it's just logical because it's so much better for the environment than anything. Certainly better than hydroelectric, where you're flooding whole ecosystems. Certainly better than sprawling solar and wind, on delicate ecosystems or out in the ocean, and far, far better for the environment than any kind of fossil fuel. So, it's really weird that the environmental groups were against it, but it goes back to a period in the late 60s when a faction of environmentalists led by David Brower, who's the head of the Sierra Club, and involving Paul Ehrlich, a professor at Stanford who wrote the book The Population Bomb, which David Brower was kind of the instigator of and worked with Ehrlich on it. And they thought that there were too many people, and that the more people there were, the more resources they would use, and the Earth's resources were finite. So that was the model. Growth was going to run up against these resource limits that were inevitable. And they didn't see that resources were not limited because technology could open up new resources. Innovation could make more resources available. So, for instance, on food, Paul Ehrlich said in his book that hundreds of millions of people were going to starve to death, and there are going to be these waves of death and starvation that's going to depopulate the poor countries. And of course, that didn't happen at all. It's completely wrong. We have way higher population now and way fewer starving people in the world because the Green Revolution made more food accessible. But their thought was, if there's abundant clean energy, and that's what nuclear was promising, then that would mean people would, if you have a lot of cheap electricity on your wall outlet, you're going to want to plug stuff into it. So it would mean more stuff, more consumption, more people, and that would strain the Earth's resources. So originally, that was it. It was that nuclear was going to be too cheap, too abundant.
It's going to be too good.
Too good, right. And they didn't want something good. They wanted to run up against these limits and show us that we had to stop growing and we needed fewer people. I don't know how they were going to get that. And use less stuff. And this is still a big theme of theirs, degrowth, consume less, and all of that.
Energy efficiency.
Yeah. And meanwhile, these people who didn't starve to death back then have grown in these societies throughout the world. Most of the world's population, by a good margin, are in countries that are pretty poor. but growing, and people are getting their feet under them. Hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty, especially in China, and into kind of middle class life. And they're doing it by using more energy. And they're doing it with the cheapest, most practical energy they have, which is fossil fuels. So the environmental position, led directly to this continued reliance on fossil fuels. And if you wind back the clock to before that, back to the 1960s, people in government and nuclear industry, the planners, were figuring that we in the United States, followed by the rest of the world, were going to make a transition off of fossil fuels and onto nuclear energy because it was going to be cheaper and more practical and better all around. And if we had just stayed with the program that we were on then, we literally wouldn't have the climate crisis now. Like most of the CO2 up there has now been put in since then because we didn't do nuclear and we kept burning more and more fossil fuel. Yeah. And now, by fast forward to today, we're still burning more fossil fuel than ever. And yes, we're adding a lot of clean energy too. It's growing really fast, but it's only just keeping up with the growth of demand. So people in poor countries are using more and more energy as they get less poor. And so electricity is growing, and part of that is renewables, but not enough to take down the fossil fuel part. So we're still like 80% fossil fuel in the world economy. And when we're burning more coal than ever, it's slowed down, but that's not the point. We have to stop burning it because every coal you burn puts CO2 up in the atmosphere. So so that's where you realize like there's not many ways to get out of that problem. You can't tell the people in the poor countries to stop growing, to use less electricity. People who are already using far less than in the richer countries. And, that's morally wrong. And so you have to have a way that they can use more electricity, but not have it come from fossil fuels. And there's very few ways to do that, and really only one proven way, and that's what France and Sweden did. So that's the rationale behind it.
I do find there's 2 points I want to touch on. Number one, the Rockefeller point, and I want to pick your brain about this quickly. But number two, this irony now that a lot of the fossil fuel development has occurred, maybe not directly correlated, but like some of the messaging that the environmental groups, the Rocky Mountain Institute, the Rocky Mountain Defense Fund, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, right, being anti-nuclear and being pro-renewable has been so good. It's been one of the best things for the oil and gas industry globally.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we have produced so much more of it because we haven't used the even more energy dense source, right?
Right. And it's a little more to it than that too, because first of all, you list off those groups, but when you start adding up their budgets, it's just an enormous amount of money. It's just billions and billions
this
of dollars.
This is an industry. It's not a charity, right?
Yeah,
this is a real business.
Yeah, and now they're sort of paired up with wind and solar industry, or the so-called renewables industry, and so it's pretty direct. A lot of money involved, but just their budgets alone, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, et.cetera., and the money that's gone to make everyone afraid of nuclear power, it's really hard to get a counter message out. It's $1 billion a year or something. It's the level of a U.S. presidential campaign, right? So imagine you're running for president, nobody's heard of you, and you don't have any money, and you're up against $1 billion budget to demonize you. You're not going to win that election. So that's what we've been up against.
And why would you change your messaging when you're getting $1 billion? It's like, it worked in last year's budget. It's illogical to modify our message if we're continuing to get donations, right?
And I can't prove it,
but I think that is
certainly
changing.
I've heard that many of the leaders in these organizations know that they're wrong on the issue now, but they have big donors who are committed to it. They have big anonymous donors, so we don't really know where that money's coming from. But you lose a lot of money when you spend 50 years making someone afraid of something, and hype them up. They have to give you all their money because it's such a terrible threat. And then you say, oh, by the way, we changed our mind. It's not such a threat. They're going to stop giving you money, right?
Actually, it's the best thing ever. We got to really chase it now.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I do see a lot of millennials and Gen Zers calling out this hypocrisy, right?
Yeah.
Meaning these are, quote, environmental groups that are pushing a clean energy movement, and they're omitting the best tool in the toolbox. You
Right.
know, and it's good. I think it's good that these people are being called out for this hypocrisy. But
Yeah. This
circling back,
Replanet campaign called Dear Greenpeace has been great. Just
yeah, love those guys.
Dear Greenpeace, you're great. We love you, but you really screwed up on this one issue. Why don't you change it? That's how I feel.
Yeah.
And I'm a lifetime member of the Sierra Club. I love the Sierra Club and everything they do, except on this issue. They're just dead wrong. But it's such an important issue that it really troubles me. I can't just kind of say, well, I don't agree with them on this, but everything else okay. Like, this is the heart of everything.
You got this cognitive dissonance, right? Like,
yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to circle back real quick. So you mentioned Rockefeller. When I've looked into it, and I'm curious on your research on this, yeah, John D. Rockefeller made gobs of money in oil, right? The original oil tycoon. But I perceived when I read the history that his children and the foundation were kind of felt guilty for how much wealth they had accumulated from fossil fuels and weren't necessarily completely behind the fossil fuel movement anymore. And so I don't know if that when I've heard people come out in the pro-nuclear industry and say, well, fossil fuels people don't like this because it's just going to put them out of business.
Yeah.
I personally disagree with that. So I'm curious on your perspective and what kind of research or evidence you found that shows otherwise, or was there active campaigns?
I have a nuanced view of it. It's a little bit complex, and I wouldn't actually be one to demonize the fossil fuel industry for this, but the Rockefeller Foundation did do something really bad here. I can't say the family told them to do it. It was closely tied to the family, but their whole way of life was fossil fuels. And so that may have influenced them. But what they said was this guy Fosdick was running the foundation, and then this guy Warren Weaver, a mathematician, was their head of natural sciences. And basically Fosdick told Warren Weaver to go make everyone afraid of radiation, give you the detail of it. But the reasoning behind it was they felt bad that they had played a role in the Manhattan Project,
right,
to create the bomb in World War II. And the guy who they had funded generously, who had come through the critical thing, his cyclotron that was, he said, like, no Rockefeller Foundation, no bomb. They played a critical role there.
That's right.
And they said, what have we done? What have we created? Because, a lot of the scientists, my uncle was one who worked at Los Alamos and was later a big anti-nuclear war advocate. A lot of them felt they had created a technology.
I think almost everyone on the Manhattan Project, not everyone. Yeah, Teller was like bigger and bigger bombs. Here we go. Right. But many of them, came out and were like, this is bad.
So the Rockefeller people were immediately, alarmed that they may have done something bad, and they felt guilty about it. So what they did was they found in 1944 a scientist named Herman Muller, who he had done the original work irradiating fruit flies in the late 1920s in the Columbia University, the fly room. This thing, it should be a movie. I'd like to make a movie out of it. Maybe it won't be me, but it's interesting characters. So Muller had irradiated flies and claimed that he had created mutations, and they didn't know what DNA was yet. They knew there was something called a gene, that they knew there was material there that was shaping what the organism came out like. And he could blast these fruit flies with radiation and make them have, eyes where their wings should be, and these weird mutations and spooky, scary mutations. So it turned out, to fast forward, that what he was doing was blasting them with super high doses of radiation and just blowing away whole sections of their chromosomes. It was not making little mutations in the DNA.
That the NRC is protecting against today, right?
Right. So,
Yeah.
but his theory of it was that he was producing these point mutations with radiation, and the whole role of radiation in evolutionary history was that that's how species were evolving, by having these mutations from radiation and all this. It turned out it was all wrong. And don't get me started on this topic. We'll run out of time if we only have an hour. But
Right.
but the essence of it was that he had done this work and then had gone off to the Soviet Union because he admired Stalin and stuff. And then he discovered, no, he didn't like Stalin. And he was bouncing around during the war. He got a job in Amherst College, and he was a bad teacher, and they were firing him. So at the time that the Rockefellers, took up his cause, 1944, he was broke, he was divorced, he was unemployed, just a down on his luck scientist. And the Rockefellers, at that time, governments were not the main ones funding science in the United States. It was these foundations. So the Rockefellers put him in a tenured position at Indiana University. They made a deal with the university. They paid his salary. They paid his lab, all the people who worked in his lab, his travel budget, everything. It's all paid for by the Rockefeller Foundation. And Indiana University is like, sure, why not? So then they set him up there. And then everyone was freaked out about the bomb. And so the Nobel Prize in 1945 went to Muller because of this discovery about the dangers of radiation, which was on everybody's mind then. So he goes to give his Nobel Prize speech, and he's got letters from some of his colleagues that saying, they didn't reproduce his results. They don't find that low-level radiation is causing harm. His theory was that if this dose that he gave caused X amount of harm, then half the dose would cause half of X, and so forth, linear curve all the way down to zero. So one little beam of light could knock out one little piece of the genetic material and cause a mutation. And so he was very attached to this idea, and that's probably what the Rockefellers liked about him, because it would make everyone afraid of radiation. And of course, the fallout from the tests, the fallout was a case of low-level radiation. But all the evidence about harm came from high-level radiation, primarily, like fruit flies blasted with really high doses. He couldn't show any harm from low doses. He used high doses and extrapolated them. And then the bomb survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they got high level of radiation, and you could see harm was caused there. And at a certain high dose,
I've looked at that data. I agree.
Died from
high level radiation is very dangerous.
Right? Yeah. And then a little bit lower, there was leukemia out of it, and then you go lower than that, and you start to lose any harm. So you've got this theory that low-level radiation causes harm to human health, but you can't measure it. Nobody's ever proven that it exists, because the low levels don't create enough of an effect to measure. So to me, that's not science. Like, we know this is out there, but we can't measure it, so we're just going to say it's there. But the Rockefeller Foundation continued to support him, and he was a major figure in the field of genetics, which was entirely funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So everybody in that field was funded by them, and they were creating it with him at the head of the field. They had a conference in the 1950s, mid-50s, called the Biological Effects of Atomic Radiation, and they proposed this to the National Academy of Sciences and said, we'll pay for it all, the Rockefellers. So just like Indiana University, like, okay. So now you've got the Academy of Sciences on it, and they have 6 groups looking at different aspects of the effects of radiation, at least one of which were actual biologists who knew something about that. And they discovered, we don't see any effect of low-level radiation. But one of the groups was the genetics group, and that was all these people, including Muller and all the Muller followers. And instead of having it chaired by a geneticist, Warren Weaver himself from the Rockefeller Foundation comes in and chairs it. And he tells them things like, if this comes out right, there's going to be a lot of money in it for all of you. And he's funding all these people. He knows what the result he wants. And they just steamrolled over the contrary evidence and came out with a report, 5 of the 6 committees not finding any harm, and one of them saying, yes.
And the one that was chaired by Weaver said it was.
The one chaired by Weaver says any level of radiation is harm to human health. And that's the one that it gets into the front page of the New York Times, the next day, and the one that we all remember. So then the whole regulatory framework comes about with nuclear power, and it's all based on this idea, linear, no threshold, that as low as you go on your dose, you're just getting less of the same harm. And it's all based explicitly on a theory of human biology that says that DNA cannot be repaired. This is what Muller said. Harm to DNA is irreparable. It's cumulative over your life. It doesn't matter if you get a dose all at once or spread out over time because you can't repair it anyway.
Which we know is exactly wrong.
And now we know it's completely it's been proven wrong. They've given the Nobel Prize about 8 years ago for DNA repair mechanisms, which are extensive and wondrous. And, the body's really complicated. But one thing is, we evolved on a planet full of radiation, and we evolved mechanisms to keep the DNA kicking along, even when it gets knocked out from radiation, more often from oxidation than radiation. But anyway, DNA does repair itself. So here we've got a whole theory that we know explicitly is contrary to the science, and yet the regulatory bodies have kept it in place to this day. Linear, no threshold. I sometimes call it straight, no chaser for no good reason. But it's like, all the way down.
That's funny.
Down. And so it means that if you're designing a nuclear power plant, you have to protect against any release of any radiation. And, you can't do that with like an oil refinery. Like, we'll never, ever spill oil from an oil refinery anywhere in the world. If we do, the whole industry has to shut down. And it's completely impractical to run things that way. And none of the competing power sources have that. A hydroelectric dam will never burst. If a hydro dam bursts, we got to get rid of all the hydro dams. But that's the attitude towards nuclear. And even the tiniest, was I just seeing the latest thing I saw was headlines in the newspaper because I forget which nuclear plant had a backup system in case things went wrong, which they didn't. And then the backup system relied on generators, to keep the core from overheating. And the generators relied on diesel fuel that was carried in pipes, and they had found some cracks in some of the pipes. It wasn't that the pipes weren't working, they found cracks in them, right? And so it's like, oh no, stop the world. We have to fix the cracks in case, this series of things happens that might possibly lead to a release, which is considered to be catastrophic. And people don't understand radioactivity, and partly because of this Rockefeller Foundation story, we're all trained to be afraid of radioactivity and radiation, but we don't treat it as though there was a dose. We treat it as though it's a sort of categorical thing. If any gets out, then it'll destroy the world. And this is how they treat, nuclear spent fuel. Like, you can put it underground, but if 100,000 years from now some gets out, then that's going to be somehow catastrophic. And we know that's completely false, completely wrong. But that's how it is. It's like radioactivity. It's an absolute. And that's what the Rockefellers wanted, the foundation. They wanted people to have this kind of absolute aversion and taboo on anything nuclear, anything about radiation and radioactivity. And I guess to their credit, we haven't blown up the world with a nuclear war. So, maybe they're right about that. But, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the price we've paid has just been horrific because it's locked in place climate change and fossil fuels for all these decades. And now we're trying to find our way out of that.
Well, that's what podcasts like this are meant to do, right? Educate people and change it. So, and things like your book and Nuclear Net, right? So let's chat about A Bright Future. Can you give a synopsis for the audience? And you released this in 2019.
Yeah. So I was learning about nuclear energy, and I learned about the case of Sweden. Sweden I have a soft spot for Sweden because it's come up in a couple of my books. The War and Gender book and also the Diplomacy and Peace book keep coming back to Sweden. So I was in Sweden talking about war and gender, and I had the chance to go visit the nuclear power plant at Ringhals, which I write about in the book, and compare with a German coal plant, which is quite a comparison. It's like couldn't have two more different facilities in terms of the environmental impact of them on climate change and everything else. But I I was interested in how Sweden had built these plants quickly and decarbonized the grid. And I came across the writings from a Swedish nuclear engineer, Staffan Kvist, who was writing academic articles on how the rest of the world could do what Sweden did. And I'm like, that's what I want to write the book about. So I contacted him and asked if he wanted to collaborate on the book. And he did. So that was great for me because I'm a political scientist and I don't have the chops to make sure everything is right. I do have the instinct to make sure I don't have mistakes in my work. And I'm very careful about stuff, especially if there's data involved. Very careful. If you read my book, it better have the right story, So with Stefan, I could get the right story and he could make sure that it's all correct and scientifically accurate, which then I was able to do with the film for Oliver. So that was the story of the book. We wrote it up. It starts out, it's probably too cute, but we use a gimmick where the word nuclear never appears in the title, the subtitle, the back cover, the front material, the jacket flaps, or the entire first 2 chapters. First chapter is about climate change and how urgent it is, which I feel strongly, more so now than 5 years ago or 10 years ago, 30 years ago, and I've been watching it the whole time and really concerned that it's off track. We're off track. So that's the first chapter, climate change, very serious problem. And the second chapter is about Sweden. But in that second chapter, it's about how Sweden discovered a almost magical energy source called kernkraft that would power their grid without producing carbon dioxide or noxious particulate matter, blah, blah, blah. It's so environmental, it's so great. And then at the, like the last sentence of the chapter is, of course, kernkraft means nuclear power in Swedish, right? So I think occasionally somebody actually didn't quite get where it was going, but most of the time I figured they know it's about nuclear power, but it doesn't hit the brain, the word nuclear, and this is changing just in the last few years, but at that time, I really felt the word nuclear landed in people's brains in a way that would, ping their trauma about it, and that it was better to talk about it without triggering that, using the trigger word. I don't think that's true anymore, and obviously the film Nuclear Now, we're past that stage. So it's now you can talk. So now the taboo is starting to lift, but it's still pretty strong. You read articles about climate change and they just never mention nuclear power. It's so frustrating. And sometimes they'll say, where we get our energy from is this amount from natural gas and this amount from coal and this from solar, wind, and hydroelectric. And you go, well, wait, that doesn't add up. It's like we're missing 20%. Well, that's 20% is nuclear power. And they can't bring themselves to use the word. It's a real taboo. It goes back to that Rockefeller Foundation thing, the fear, radiation, radioactivity, nuclear. And so journalists often just don't talk about it. Just something you don't talk about. And that was part of the point of the book and the movie was to get it out in the open now. In the last few years, there's been a lot of change on that. The taboo is lifting and people are talking about it openly now to some extent. And yet still most of what you read about climate solutions, it just assumes that we build a lot of solar and wind, a lot of transmission lines, and then everything will be cool. And
I think it takes a long time for society to have these feedback loops, right? I remember graduating from school and I was like, there's no way that climate change or wind and solar are going to make a dent, and here we are a decade later and the Inflation Reduction Act passes. Right. And I'm like, wow, definitely made a wrong bet here. Definitely underestimated how much people would care about this moving forward, right? I just thought, people would care about cost and price more.
Right. But then you look at Germany, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And, eventually, late in the process of closing all their nuclear power down, they started to wonder if that was such a good idea. But they still just went ahead and closed everything down. So that's pretty hard. And then replaced it with coal because they were going to replace it all with cheap Russian gas. What could go wrong? And so then when they didn't have that, it's coal.
Yeah.
And it's still so much coal and gas and oil. around the world, especially in the poorer countries. So this gets to something that bugs me in the whole discourse about climate change and clean energy, which is that the rich countries are like 1 billion out of the 8 billion people on the planet. And the poorest of the poor are another billion that just don't have electricity, pretty much. And then in between is 6 billion people that they have some electricity, they need more, they want more, they want to get a refrigerator, and that kind of thing. It's not just a light bulb to read by. That's great for, kids in school, but you want a refrigerator, and then you're going to want all the other things that go with electricity. So yeah, the conversation is as though the billion rich people are what's going to determine the outcome in climate change. And even to the point of like the state of Massachusetts thinks like if we build a bunch of wind and solar, that's where I live, Massachusetts. If we build a bunch of wind and solar, then we can decarbonize Massachusetts, and then we're doing our part, and that'll solve climate change. It's like, and it's very urgent. In order to solve climate change, Massachusetts has to build a bunch of wind and solar.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying it's a bad idea to build it. I happen to think it is, but the point is that it's not going to make any difference to the outcome. And so what a place like Massachusetts, and really the whole billion rich people, should be doing is to create the tools by which those 6 billion people can grow and enjoy energy and grow up out of poverty into prosperity without burning fossil fuels. It means we need to be creating new technologies that can work in those parts of the world, because it's really expensive to do it the way we're trying to do it in Massachusetts or Germany. Germany, maybe they can afford it, or maybe all their industry is going to move to France where electricity is cheaper. But Indonesia cannot afford it. Absolutely cannot. And if you give them a choice of clean, beautiful electricity powered by wind, solar, and batteries at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, or 20, I think we're paying 20 cents for offshore wind here in Massachusetts, versus coal at 5 cents, they're going to burn coal. And I can't blame them. That's not, you can't just tell those poor countries that they can't do it because we've used up all the carbon that the atmosphere can handle.
Yeah. So
we need a way. We need something cheap. So this is my nuclear power pitch to the nuclear industry: is make it cheap. It's got to be. We've got to figure a way to do this cheaper. And part of that is getting over the radiation fear that leads to this overregulation. That means that every power plant needs to be, spending tons of money to prevent tiny amounts of radiation from being released. And part of it is just that the industry needs to focus more on cheap solutions that'll work around the world.
Yeah. Be great at building projects, deliver stuff on time, under budget.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of those are happening. I mean, there's some progress. The nuclear plant in the United Arab Emirates, as you know, South Koreans came in and built that on time, on budget. It's not as cheap as it would need to be, but it's getting in that direction. And then the anti-nuclear people always point to this plant that just opened in Georgia, the Vodal plant, and which was just a fiasco. It was the first try in 30 years, and everything went wrong, and the regulation set it off track, and the people building it screwed it up too. And the whole thing's just been the wrong model, and it ended up really expensive. And then they're like, see, nuclear is too expensive to be helpful for climate change. Well, that one plant is. If they were all like that, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because we need something cheaper. But then at the other extreme is these plans on floating nuclear plants built in shipyards, mass produced. But one way or the other, we need to get to mass manufactured, low cost nuclear power plants. And I like the floating plants built in shipyards a lot, and then send them where they're going. But however you go, and there's some other ways to do it, it's got to be cheap. It's got to be mass manufactured, and it has to be something that you can really use all around the world. And then you can really start to knock out coal plants the way places like Ontario did. In a little more than a decade, they knocked coal out by expanding their nuclear, or France just decarbonizing in 15 years. So
can I try and trace this back with you?
That?
I said, can I try and trace this back with you then?
Yeah.
I mean, we want to build more nuclear, decarbonize, but it'll be better if we can replace or build those systems before we shut down other existing energy systems in the poorer parts of the world. It feels immoral to shut those systems down first, but we have to build as much as we can. We have to make it cheap, and in order to do that, we have to perhaps peel back some regulation, allow people to innovate, allow us to export stuff.
Yeah.
And in order to peel back the regulation, we got to have conversations like this, right? And make films like Nuclear Now and write books like A Bright Future, right? So
Right.
has
That's it. That's the program.
that's why we're here.
I'm all for the other things that there's a lot going on in climate change and more each year. And, I'm a big fan of deep geothermal. I'm a fan of natural gas with carbon capture. That's really promising. And wind and solar, when they're a small part of the grid, they can be really cheap until they start to really screw up the grid and you need this expensive storage and transmission and all that stuff that they're trying to do here. But, in relatively small amounts, they're pretty good. I drive an electric car. I had solar up on my roof, So they're all good. But the point is you do all that stuff and you realize with a growing energy system in the world, you're just barely keeping up with growth. You're not getting the decarbonization that we need. We're just not getting there, and we're maybe going to get halfway there with all our most ambitious efforts. And you look into the bag of tricks, like what else do we have in here? And there's nothing in there but nuclear power. And you go, okay, this other half of this problem has to be solved with nuclear. Has to be it. People who say either they say I'm not against nuclear power, or they say like I'm pro-nuclear. I think it's an important piece of the solution or something, but they're really talking about like nuclear power to fill in the last 10 or 20% of things after you just can't get there with all this other expensive stuff. And I don't see it that way. I see it as, the other stuff.
It should be the first thing we're building.
Sort of the opposite. Yeah, like do everything we can with nuclear power. A specific example on that, if you want to,
Sure.
The Bill Gates company TerraPower is building a reactor in Wyoming. It's a big coal place, so that's great, and they're building it at a retiring coal plant, which is a good model. They have these molten salt storage tanks so that they can run the reactor around the clock, which is what it does best, but then store the energy when there's low grid demand and give it back when there's high grid demand. By the way, also, store it when the price is low for selling it and then sell it when the price is high. So it's a good economic model for them. They always pitch it as, this is going to work well with wind and solar on the grid, renewables that come and go. And I guess to a certain extent that's true if you can store some and then let it out when it's needed. That is. But I started to think, actually, that would work the best for an all-nuclear grid because you've got these day-night variations that are very predictable in the grid. You can't predict when the wind and sun are going to produce. So if suddenly the wind stops blowing and the sun isn't shining, that's too much for this storage of the nuclear plant to make up for. It's only sort of moderate amounts. But what it reminds me of is the plant near me that has shut down unnecessarily, Vermont Yankee. When they built that, they also built a pumped storage hydro system nearby where they pump water up the mountain at night when there's a lot of electricity from the nuclear plant, not much demand, and then in the day when there's more demand, they let the water down from the mountain and generate extra electricity that way. And that handles the day-night cycle, and it's wonderful for the grid. It's really stable. It's really easy. You don't need all this very complicated transmission and storage stuff that the wind and solar need. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the right mix would be, and it's going to be different in different places, but I really feel like nuclear should be the backbone of a clean energy economy.
Yeah. Well, I think you and I agree there. What's been the feedback from Nuclear Now? Has it been well received? Personally, I loved it.
Yeah.
I heard about it coming out long before it was released, and I was annoyed at how long it took you guys to get it out. I was like, how do I watch this film? I want to watch this film.
I know. Very frustrating. So really two answers to that. Among the people who have watched it, it's been extremely well received. And, we released it first at the Venice Film Festival a year ago, and it was 1,000 people in a theater. First time we showed it on a screen in front of an audience, and you never know how it's going to go. So it was a 10-minute standing ovation. So that was good. Of course, the Italians are enthusiastic about cinema anyway, but basically we've had a very, very good response when it's shown. And it was a New York Times critics pick, a very positive review on it. Some of the reviews were like surprised because Oliver Stone seems very reasonable and down to earth here, and unlike some of his other movies. I don't know. He's a really good filmmaker, and he's a really smart guy. And I completely disagree with him on some other issues that he likes to mouth off about. But as far as making a great film, he really did a wonderful job. So that's the good side. And then the bad side is that distribution channels wouldn't take it. And we went out to sell it after Venice, and I didn't, but the Hollywood people, and everybody was turning it down. They all turned it down because they're afraid of nuclear. They don't like the controversy. I think Hollywood, ever since Me Too, they're sort of in a play it safe mode. Don't want to get in trouble. Oliver Stone could be trouble. Nuclear energy could be trouble. So they just wouldn't buy it, and Netflix wouldn't put it on, and so forth. And then eventually we got a distribution deal where we came out in a couple of theaters for a week in like LA and New York, and a bunch of theaters, 400 theaters in North America, but only for one night only. So and those varied a lot from, sold out and a lively discussion afterwards to, basically an empty theater. But it got it out there. And then eventually, pretty soon after that, got to Amazon and Apple TV pay-per-view. That's probably where you were able to see it. I don't know where you saw it, but
we had a watch party. We we sold out a theater to go and watch it.
Excellent.
Colorado Nuclear Alliance, the advocacy group that we help out with here, was like, here we go.
Yeah, that's great. And we had some really wonderful screenings, and we had the kind of flagship screening in Washington D.C. at the Navy Memorial, and which I was at, and Oliver, and a lot of D.C. people, some in the nuclear industry and some in Congress and journalists and stuff. That went really well. Came out on DVD, so that's another way people can see it now. But the international distribution only just getting started now. And I'm with you. I'm so frustrated that it took so long. And I wish everyone in the world could see it. We were talking at one point about trying to raise some money and, buy the rights to the film and put it on YouTube for free for everyone in the world to see. Yeah. It may yet get there in the end, but they're doing something more traditional with it. And it's got distribution deals now in everywhere from a number of European countries to South Korea, Australia, and some in between, a bunch of countries. Not Germany. They didn't want it.
That's so weird, man.
Hard to show
that's
there, but,
so weird.
I think it will percolate its way out. And, for me not being part of Hollywood, this being my only film and all, there's really nothing I can do about it. I don't understand the whole distribution side of, I don't understand that making side of movies either, but I did participate in that. But distribution, it's another whole world. How you get people to have heard of the movie and to have a chance to see it. Yeah. I think over time it'll get out there to a wider audience.
Okay. Well, you've hit most of the questions that we had, and a few more that we didn't. So I thank you so much for your work. I just, as being part of the pro-nuclear advocacy movement and wanting to work in the space and build stuff in the industry, it's people like you that are really making a difference and helping to carry this torch further. So
I think that the biggest difference the film made was for people who were already pro-nuclear, but maybe thought they were the only ones who were in their crowd, or didn't feel brave enough to stick their necks out or talk about it, whatever. Right. It's just like put a tailwind behind the whole pro-nuclear movement, and gave people a tool they could use to show other people, what it is they believe in that may be complicated to explain. So I think that's been really good to show support to those of you that are already out there doing this work, and hey, here's a film you can use.
We appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. Dr. Goldstein, leave us with your most positive view of the future. What's the
Well,
world going to look like in the next 10 to 20 years, and how are we going to help get it there?
I think 10 years is probably the wrong time frame because climate change is going to play out slower than that. I know it's like climate change is here. We should all be in a panic. And I sort of feel we should be in a panic, but only because things we do now are going to affect the world of 50 to 100 years from now. That's when it's really going to be really serious. Like if what we're having now, big fires and hurricanes, is all we had to deal with, we'd be okay. But we're going to have real destabilizing stuff 50 years from now, and so the second half of the century and on into next century. And I have a granddaughter now who's 1 year old, so I'm thinking in that frame, her next 100 years is going to be dominated by this issue. So the 10 years is not the right frame, and that's like, we only have 10 years, build a bunch of wind and solar because that's the fastest way to get energy on the grid right now. Like, okay, but if you built nuclear, then 15 or 20 years, you'd have a lot more. So I think the 2030s, the 2040s, that's when nuclear is going to start to shine. And my vision of the future is that there's a technological style, some people call it, of like how technologies underpin an economy and work together. And I see nuclear emerging as the core energy technology in the world, as it was imagined 50, 70 years ago, getting back to that vision of things. But to my mind, fossil fuels are ripe for disruption. They're dirty, they're expensive, they're annoying, they're so cumbersome with all this volume of stuff you have to dig up and burn and the waste and all of that. And it's a multi-trillion-dollar a year industry. So that somebody's going to make a lot of money on nuclear, right? Because you got something that's ripe for disruption. If you figure out this kind of mass manufactured, low cost nuclear that sells around the world, you're going to make a ton of money and you're going to save the planet. So that's my happy vision for somebody making money. It won't be me. I have no financial interest in anything nuclear because I want to be a professor and be, objective about the subject. But I think it'll be good that investors who go into nuclear do make money. Some of them will lose their shirts, of course. But overall, I see a big change there of the economy reorienting off of fossil fuels and onto nuclear. It's going to take some decades to do that, though, obviously.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Goldstein, thanks so much for the time. This has been great.
It's been fun to be with you. Thanks for a good
Absolutely.
conversation. Yeah.